And actually, I'm a historian of magic, so I worked a lot on the history of magic over the past 15 years. So I would have a lot to say on this year's tarot card, but I'm not here for that, but rather to present a project to you which has just started its work at the University of Erlangen. And I'm kind of an ambassador of this project here on Transstates. Would like to introduce its research ideas and agenda, and then hopefully engage in a discussion of what this has to do with practitioners and with meetings between scholars and practitioners, and let's see how that goes. So I will first introduce you into the project a bit, then into its research agenda, go a bit into its tools, and then explain why I'm here and what this may have to do with Transstates. So, this project is funded by the German Research Foundation. It's a so-called Kollegforschungsgruppe. It's a collaborative research group, basically a fellowship program with the local staff. It has a fairly huge amount of funding, 4.6 million euros over 4 years, and then another 4 years, so almost over 9 million euros for this project, which is unheard of in German academia for an esotericism-related project. It's the biggest format that exists in the German funding system. So it's really quite an outstanding thing. These groups are designed for interdisciplinary research. So it is basically a fellowship program. We will soon have our first cohort of 10 fellows in Erlangen. And these fellows work together with a number of local scholars so that we all have the possibility to explore an interesting research topic over a long period of time. That's basically the idea. Yeah, and we will have at least 9 employees, 3 professors are involved, 3 postdoc coordinators, a bunch of other people, and then we can give up to 7 full fellowships per year. So it's almost 20 people in the house for esotericism research over the next 4 to 8 years. And so I think this is kind of the biggest esotericism-related project right now on the world. And I'm one of its founding fathers and also scientific coordinator. We started in April to set it up and will now begin with the actual work with the fellows from October onwards. I'm quoting a bit from our application. This is actually the very first paragraph, might give you an idea what we want to do. A Chinese feng shui master, an Israeli expert in Kabbalah, Mashizo practical Kabbalah, a German ritual magier, an Indian Vastu offerer, an Egyptian Sahir, a Caribbean Brujo, a West African Vodun practitioner, a Malayan Bomo exorcist. What do these figures share in common? How can we gain an understanding of their experiences and practices? And can we undertake a comparative study of the practices of these experts without allowing Eurocentric stereotypes or an imperialism of categories to distort our analysis? So this is really a global project, an interdisciplinary project, and a comparative project. So we want to reintroduce true comparison in the study of religion and cultural studies and also anthropology. We want to open up a global field of research on such practices from a transcultural perspective and map and typologize what is out there right now. So it's contemporary. We want to compare the interpretation, rationalization, and legitimization strategies of these practices and practitioners from a global perspective. One of our main questions is why they are successful, resilient, and creative in different cultural and regional contexts. We want to develop a taxonomic framework or a meta-language for the future investigation of these practices. And ultimately, we want to formulate a new cultural theory of esoteric practices, which seeks to explain their resilience against or together with dominant discourses of science and technology, and their typological similarities, but also differences across a large number of cases, and the different culture-bound and politically shaped evaluations in different parts of the world. So we have a contemporary and global research focus, and so one of our core disciplines is anthropology, and we have a praxeological focus, meaning that we are predominantly interested in practices, practical experiences, and praxis knowledge, whereas ideas, dogmas, theories, and worldviews, which have been kind of the dominant focus of the study of esotericism or Western esotericism, they may rather take a backseat in our project, even though they're not unimportant, but we focus on practices. Now I want to outline two things in greater detail. One is our definition of esoteric practices. Maybe that's interesting and also important. And the other one is a question matrix or a questionnaire that we developed. So first, our definition. So we, in the project, classify practices as esoteric that, one, have as their goal the ability to identify and influence present and future life events. So that's kind of the contingency management issue, and also that which kind of rings the bell for the term magic, even though we kind of avoid that term for various reasons. Two, we are interested in practices that assume special knowledge, prolonged education, or special abilities, features that typically lead to the formation of specialization and expertism. So we're not interested in folk religion, instrumental religion, but really in the experts, in people who have underwent training, and also which includes strategies of secrecy and concealment. Three, the practices need to be based on forms of ritual efficacy which are generally concealed, so causally opaque, and so cannot or only partially be apprehended by the senses. I think you would call that ineffable, for instance. And for that reason, these practices are more or less everywhere contested to different degrees, and they're precarious, but to different degrees in different culturally and milieu-specific circumstances, because there is, especially in the 21st century, no unquestioned or generally shared explanatory model for the effects ascribed to such practices. So this kind of cumbersome formulation for the fact that, because these practices are, disputed, or they are based on ritual efficacy, which is concealed. Usually they are contested and precarious, and especially because of the dominance of scientific and technological rationalities, they're usually considered irrational, and they are contested from various sides, but to different degrees in different cultures, and we want to understand why this is the case. So what happens when you apply this definition is that, interestingly, similar practices are subject to very different cultural and social framings in different parts of the world. For instance, practices for the fabrication of numerological talismans, they may be forbidden and criminalized in certain contexts, such as Saudi Arabia or Brunei, to mention two examples, whereas they may function as an integral part of mainstream religious practice in other contexts. For instance, some regions of Tibet or China. And we are interested in understanding the dynamics and processes that inform these very different evaluations of esoteric practices. So ostracization and criminalization here, and then maybe even institutionalization there. So astrology, feng shui, even conjuring spirits, they're taught at universities in various parts of Asia. And just a brief note on alternative rationalities. So rationalities for us are of course everywhere, but we are interested in how people in different frameworks model and interpret their thoughts and actions as rational and coherent, following certain rules or scripts within the horizons of their contexts. And therefore, rationalities are always context-bound. They are ascribed or negated for various reasons, and practitioners may also use rationalities as a tool to heighten the efficacy or the perceived efficacy or legitimacy of their practices. And therefore, rationalities are alternative for us, always context-bound. They seek to plausibilize practices that, from the perspective of dominant global scientific or technological, sometimes also religious discourses, tend to be viewed as irrational. So also alternative rationality is for us kind of a context-bound category. Now, for analytical and comparative purposes, and also for collecting primary data, we developed a question matrix with currently 30 questions in 4 domains: conceptual, practical, social, and cultural, that all CASE scholars will be asked to use. These are just a few examples. So, for instance, we're interested in what are the insiders, so the IMIC concepts, terminologies, and categories used by practitioners to describe their practices in different parts of the world. In the practical domain, for instance, we are interested in the strategies that practitioners use for dealing with subjective experience of both ritual success and failure. So is this actually measured? Is this documented? Or is this neglected? Is this used to hasten the perceived success rate for the practices? For instance, writing ritual diaries to find out which practice seems to work better or less. In the social domain, we're interested in the acquisition of praxis knowledge. So is there an formal education, teacher-pupil relationships, self-training, revelatory events, initiatory groups, etc. And in the cultural domain, we're interested in political nationalist agendas, identities. Do these play a role? Do these affect the practices? Or also novel technologies, which we see here, for instance. Do the practices react to these technologies? Are the technologies transferred? Are the practices transferred to novel technologies like mobile apps? And how do the practices change in these processes? Yes, and so this is also an idea to ground our work in answers in a practitioner perspective. So we want to step back from kind of older research, which is either only text-based or even ideologically driven. We want to engage with practitioner perspectives really fundamentally. And so I guess that's also one of the reasons why I'm here on trans states. One is to present the center and our activities. If you're interested, you could, for instance, subscribe to our newsletter. We will publish a book series, a yearly book series, where we will publish our findings. We will also have a weekly hybrid lecture series from October onwards, where also interested people from outside can attend. And we will sooner or later also have a YouTube channel where we upload lectures and presentations. So that's one side of the story. But the other is that we really wish to break through habitual academic boundaries between the researcher and the researched, as Kevin does it, by creating strategic collaborations between scholars and practitioners. Because in the end, we are both researchers of the same domains from different angles, or to allude to Kevin's wording in the Trans States program, we wish to acknowledge and take into account practice-based research and esoteric scholarship as relevant data for academic knowledge production. And therefore, I would like to stress that our approach is kind of unique in present-day academia, especially in Germany, but also beyond. We're really interested in what's going on now globally, and we wish to investigate practices, which is still an unusual and largely unexplored domain, also from a methodological perspective. So we're interested in collaborations with practical researchers or also practitioner scholars, and in developing novel ways of assessing and analyzing and describing practical experiences. And I'm wondering, and this is actually how I wish to open the discussion, apart from shared lectures or shared workshops, conferences, listening to each other, having mutual inspirations, what other forms of cooperation come to your mind? What could you think? Could we profit from each other? And what, for instance, would you want a center like this to explore? Where would you want us to put our attention to? And these are the questions with which I would like to end. In case you have suggestions, you can contact me via email. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, but thank you. Very interesting. Actually, since I have the microphone, I'd like to ask the first question.
Nice.
I'm just interested if you could elaborate a bit on that notion of like global esotericism being resilient. Is it always resilient, or this notion of resilience in connection with global esotericism, I guess? And I guess that ties into a question about how possible it is to make a comparative analysis, because I guess what is taught at universities in Asia gets you burned in Africa, basically. You know, I mean, this status of whether it's a dominant or a hegemonic discourse, or if it's always sort of like a discourse under pressure, so to speak. Yeah.
Yeah. I see. So the answer is it could be long and cumbersome because it's a complex issue. We in this project started from rather an Asian perspective, so 3 involved scholars are Asianists. And I guess our starting point was overcoming 2 perspectives. One, let's call it the secularization paradigm, which was, I think, a big issue in the 20th century in the sociology of religion, that religion will eventually fade. Apparently, it did not happen, especially not on a global scale, and the same goes for practices that we could call esoteric.
I guess it was actually a pluralization instead.
Yeah, right? Yeah. So different processes actually happened, like detraditionalization, individualization, privatization of religion. But also when you look from a global perspective, also institutional religion is still very strong. And also practices that we could call esoteric, according to this working definition, for instance, they have been all over the place all the time, and they are still. So one thing is that the success of science and technology over the course of the 20th century did not really lead to a decline of any of this. To the contrary, esoteric practices, they seem to have a strong resilience, and they seem to be very dynamic, adaptable, even though in many parts of the world they are under fire, and they remain to be under fire. Also, I mean, you mentioned the cases of Africa and maybe certain parts of Asia. There are always everywhere polemics. There are institutionalized religions everywhere. There is, let's call it, scientific or instrumental rationality as the big successful export model of the West during the 19th and 20th century. So universities, science, technologies, they're everywhere. So there is always this sword of Damocles of the irrationality of certain practices, you know? So there are discourses of exclusion everywhere, but they are successful to a different degree, or also to a lesser degree. And in some states, for instance, the ruling classes, they strongly endorse astrology or other, let's call them occult arts, or from the perspective of the West. So from a global perspective, the picture is quite complex, and you have shifting boundaries of acceptability and deviance depending where you look, and also different histories So it's a multifaceted issue from a global perspective, and therefore, I mean, our task is quite huge, but we want to really develop a nuanced perspective on these questions.
That makes sense. Also, so it's like resilient against monoculture to a certain extent. Yeah. Any questions for? Yeah.
Thanks very much. Really interesting project. And this is just, kind of basic informational question. Tell me about your PhD projects that you've got starting. How are you? Have you recruited your students yet? What kind of projects are they working on? How are you sort of maintaining that global ambition in the way that they're working together?
Okay, thanks, Christine. This is not a PhD, so we don't finance qualification projects, how we call them in Germany. It's only postdocs, so all fellows are postdocs and also the staff only postdocs. But I can tell you that for each fellow cohort, we strive towards having a very global equilibration of projects: South America, Africa, Asia, not so much Western. So basically, I'm the only Westernist guy right now. And that's kind of one approach, that we have a strong equilibration. I will not go into detail with all the projects now, but of course there are the usual suspects in Africa. You have a lot of esoteric practices and traditions. In South America, you have even institutionalized religions, which we could interpret in this direction, like Candomblé, Umbanda, and a lot of spiritism. And in Asia, there's really a lot to talk about. The question is rather how to draw the boundaries to not include too much in the field, So we want to have boundaries. We do not want to go into the direction of folk religion, folk magic, because then it's all over the place. And we want to demarcate also from the more institutionalized religious practices, even though many institutionalized religions have kind of esoteric branches, mystical traditions, etc. So we still also have a lot of boundary work to do. But the good thing when you work with practice is that it's very concrete. So you can start right away by observing and talking to people. It's contemporary, which is also good. And so, and we are mostly anthropology oriented. So I think all 10 new fellows are anthropologists, or almost. I think 9 out of 10. And me too. I used to be a historian of religion. Now I trained myself in anthropological methods and I do field work. So, Yes?
Just in very practical terms, are they all starting at the same time, so they're all going to be working together and feeding off each other's work?
More or less.
How does it
more or less.
function?
Yeah.
You hope to come from that process?
I mean, there is usually people come for a year, and we ask them to start in October at the same time. It doesn't always work, but in most cases it works. But when someone drops out after half a year, a new person comes. So it's coming and going. But
they're meeting each other and discussing each other.
Yeah, we have a weekly program, a lecture series, a colloquium, and workshops. So, yeah, that's the idea. So, what about suggestions?
I was interested if you're going to do something on philosophy, African philosophy, ancient Egyptian philosophy, really, specifically in ethics and the problem of evil, which the philosophy of Mart has actually been taken up as a non-Western philosophical system by the Black Power movement in America. And there's an interesting point of connection between the pagan movement, or certainly the magical movement, which its own ethical system in magic is the Martian system of ancient Egypt. And I would have thought that's quite a I've read a couple of books on that now, on the problem of evil and on the ethical system that is not Romano, Greek or whatever. It avoids all of the kind of loaded stuff. I wonder if you're going to be doing any work on that.
Well, now that you suggested it, we could look into that direction. I can only answer for now that we are, of course, interested in ethical considerations in how far they affect practitioners, and also in historical dimensions. So if certain moral systems influence and affect modern-day esoteric practices, that's, of course, very, very important. Whether it's labeled Western or not, whether Egypt belongs to Western cultural history or not, is another matter to be disputed. But yeah. No ideas for further collaboration. So I mean, I'm also very much in Kevin's idea of practitioner scholarship. But this is still very young approach in the study of esotericism and also in religious studies. Yeah.
I would say this, wouldn't I? But my artists who make magic and magic design are getting to experience.
Yeah.
I was gonna say that about sort of like how radical we can go with methodologies, right? Because you're talking about, you know, practitioners and even people that don't practice that are just scholars or good researchers of the kind. But obviously in esotericism, the tendency is a much more radical approach, and conservatism is much more common in the academies. Have any thoughts about how would you, as well as much of the more obvious traditional, you know, anthropological tools, how much further would you be interested in pushing methodologies?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm interested in in collaborations with practitioners, including them in lectures, workshops, joint workshops, and also the things you do, like looking at the things from two angles. I think it's very important. In religious studies, it is accepted that Buddhists are Buddhist scholars and Jews are Judaism scholars, but when it comes to esotericism, this is still a problem. But I know that when you practice something, you see many things that you don't see when you only read texts. So this is very important. Also methodologically, can you actually use this data? Can you use subjective experience as relevant data? How can you make them intersubjective? So is it sufficient to only have experienced something to make it relevant to the academy, or do several people need to experience the same thing when they practice the same thing, for instance? What about repeatability? All these questions, I think they're really important when we want to push this further.
Yeah. Experimentalism to a certain extent.
Yeah, kind of maybe not an evidence-based study of esoteric practice, but experience-based at least.
Yeah.
Whatever evidence is. I mean, evidence is primarily subjective, but what is the next step then?
And with so obviously there'll be, again, qualitative data through interview and such like that, but would you again be interested in kind of other kind of different forms of them providing you with data? Like, you know, I know just in some psychedelic research and things like that, again, when we're dealing with things that are more poetic or, you know, slightly don't fit as well into kind of systemizing, and that those people might want different methods of like expression to be able to kind of like explain what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, the question is, when you do academic knowledge production, in the end you write something down or you try to explain something. This is still our main tool of knowledge distribution. And even with practices, you have a problem with long recipes, let's say magical rites. How do you describe a practice? You could write 100 pages about the Clavicula Salomonis, for instance, but what is gained by that? And the same is what you describe. You have psychedelic experiences or weird, ineffable
One
experiences.
has psychedelic experiences.
Or
How
one.
dare you accuse?
How to put them into documentation or wording so that it is an actual enhancement of our knowledge about the world.
Yeah, but of course, not to keep dragging it out, but of course people are doing that, right? So those would be interesting scholars to speak to about the kind of methods that they're employing to actually try and do that kind of thing.
Yeah.
There are taxonomies of psychedelic experience.
Yeah, sure, of course.
I
I'm
think
not questioning that.
with those words, maybe we should head off and explore inner space.